All right, Dr. Tommy Wood, when we're looking at the world of longevity, I put that in quotes because that term is just kind of thrown around all over the place. There's this idea that like metabolic health, your metabolism, everything needs to be in one specific way that's painted a certain way on the internet. Insulin's bad, this is good, protein's bad, protein's good. As someone that really sits in this sphere a lot and knows that world, I'd say pretty solid inside and out, I want to get your take on that. Like if you had to start high level, what is the biggest lever that we can pull metabolically for longevity?
After today's video, I put a link down below for an entire variety pack of LMNT electrolyte flavors. So their citrus salt, their lemon habanero, their mango chili, their chocolate salt, they're unflavored, all their awesome flavors. You get a free variety pack with any purchase. One of the things that I have talked about in other videos is if you're sleep deprived, sipping on electrolytes does help make it so that you're not wanting to eat everything in sight. Because we do know the literature suggests your brain gets activated a lot more by food cues when you're sleep deprived. I've noticed personally, anecdotally, sipping on electrolytes seems to help. They are a sponsor on this channel, they do support this channel, and your support in trying them not only is something I'd recommend, but it helps keep us doing what we're doing. So I thank you for giving them a shot, and I highly, highly do recommend them. So that link is down below, just beneath this video in the top line of the description.
So I think there's definitely some core truths in the idea that metabolic health is essential for longevity and long-term health. And that's probably really underpinned by, as you go deeper into the cell, mitochondrial function, how that then comes across in multiple tissues, how that's regulated across multiple tissues. I think that's absolutely true. The problem then becomes when people focus on a specific aspect of that and they have a certain worldview that they then demonize one, say, macronutrient or one hormone, be that protein or insulin. And obviously those two are intimately connected because protein increases insulin. But people who like low carb don't like to talk about the fact that protein increases insulin, right? Because they think insulin is the bad guy, but only when it relates to carbs and not when it relates to protein. So everybody kind of picks their own favorite thing and then chooses to argue about it. But the real kind of most important aspect of this really is that mitochondrial function and metabolic health are key drivers of both health and disease states. But we always have to be balancing increasing function, which requires aspects of growth as well as repair, which requires insulin sometimes, it requires protein, with making sure that we're not overfilling those systems with energy. And really energy surplus and energy toxicity is the main issue that we see in terms of long-term negative effects on metabolic health, and the drivers behind that. And I think we get kind of stuck in the weeds when we try to demonize one particular pathway or one particular macronutrient just because of the worldview that we have.
I find it kind of interesting how as the internet has allowed us to have so much information sort of at our fingertips, it's in our nature to sort of go down one particular rabbit hole and become almost obsessed with that. I want to come back to insulin in a moment, but you said something a while back that was really interesting. I can't remember where. It was actually Matt, one of my employees that had found it, and you mentioned that essentially metabolic health, as it relates to longevity, becomes somewhat less important for lean people, but more important for people that are overweight or, essentially ultimately in poor metabolic health. Can you explain that a little bit more and like what you mean by that, how that relates to someone that's healthy versus not?
I think part of it relates to the effect of different tissues on our health and then how well they function. So when you look at, say, blood sugar regulation, and in people who are relatively active or relatively lean, their blood sugar regulation on average is a lot better. It's more stable. They can dispose of glucose, like postprandial glucose spikes, faster. They can use that. They can use or dispose of that glucose more easily. Whereas in those who maybe have worse body composition or they have worse metabolic health, you essentially need to continuously create a sink for that glucose. So there are lots of studies that show if you want to improve, say, metabolic health with physical activity, if you don't lose weight or you don't improve and I think overall body composition is more important than total mass. Total weight doesn't really mean anything. So if you need to improve your body composition in order to see long-term improvements in fasting and postprandial glucose. But if you don't do that, then you can still improve your blood sugar regulation with physical activity, but it's just in the moment. You have to continuously do it. You have to continuously create that sink because you're still in this overall state of essentially surplus energy. So there are two parts to this. If you have relatively good body composition and good muscle mass, you have this buffer, this metabolic buffer that gives you a little bit more leeway, which I think you need in modern society based on our food environment and our physical environment. But if you don't have that, you're essentially in this much more fragile metabolic state where you have to continuously create sinks for glucose in particular, but also generally calories, so that you can dispose of any excess. So it comes down to how much of a buffer I think you have to deal with the modern food environment in particular.
I want to pivot over. Okay, because you're talking about people that are already metabolically healthy, or let's just even go so far as saying already fit, versus maybe someone that is not. Obviously, we have the world of like lipokines and exerkines and whatnot. I'm not sure how well versed in this area you are, but one of the questions that I've had is, as someone becomes more trained, and I don't even mean athlete, I just mean no more newbie gains, no more, they're no longer considered a noob. They've been training for 6 months. Do you get an enhanced effect from exercise as far as that is concerned? Because one could almost imply that as you become more conditioned and more trained, you require more exercise to get the same desired metabolic effect, or to achieve more. I guess maintenance is different, but you have to train harder to build more muscle. You probably have to train more to get more mitochondrial density, after you've reached a certain point. Does the same thing seem to apply for these, exerkines and various lipokines, 1,2,1,3 dihome and stuff like that? And maybe give a brief overview of what those are first, since I rattled off something that people probably are like, what the hell is that?
So there are these broad groups of metabolites that are released from different organs during physical activity, movement, exercise, whatever you want to call it. We used to call them myokines, or there are myokines that are released from muscle tissue, but then we've also found that there are these metabolites released from other tissues, that non-muscle tissues during exercise. So they're called exokines. So things released from the liver during physical activity that have broad effects across the body and through the brain. So those are the exokines. And the one that there are several. So, and what's always interesting to me is that I think we can probably agree that physical activity is the most important thing for metabolic health, longevity, disease prevention, probably disease treatment. But we don't really know how it works. Every year, there are several new metabolites that are discovered. In recent years, we've had irisin, we've had MOTS-C, we have all these new things that get released and have all these supposedly amazing benefits. So we still don't really know how it works. But part of it is these exokines or myokines, depending on where they're being released from during physical activity. I think you're right that, as with most tissues in the body, the function is driven by the demand that we place on them, and you get the biggest increases in function early on in that process. So if you have low function to begin with, then those first gains, those noob gains, are when you first start to train, and you need to train harder to get smaller gains as you increase in function. However, I think from what I've seen, the exocynes, or at least some of the ones that have been studied. So BDNF is one that gets studied a lot. That's released from muscle tissue during exercise. It seems to be proportional to the amount of muscle that is being moved, and then there's some like area under the curve, like intensity times time, right? So if it's more intense, a shorter period of time, versus if it's less intense, you need a longer period of time to get the same. So there's like an area under the curve thing. So I think it's proportional to the total volume and the muscle mass being moved, rather than saying as you get fitter, you need more exercise to get more BDNF release. At least from the studies I've seen, I think it's muscle mass and volume that are the biggest determinants.
So do a bunch of steroids when you're young, get huge.
Exactly. That's the way. Isn't that that's always the answer. Yeah.
Okay, that is interesting though. So, and that was actually going to be another question that I had probably offline that I was just curious about was, from an energetic standpoint, I mean, obviously you're going to get more out of your non-exercise activity thermogenesis the more mass that you're carrying. But I was wondering if, like, as far as metabolically and sort of the benefit of moving more mass just through sheer life, not to mention exercise, exhibits more of a metabolic benefit. So just in some ways, it's like, okay, does the weight really matter? If someone has more muscle mass on them up to a certain point, could they be at a metabolic advantage because of the exocynes and myokines that they secrete, but also possibly other effects, maybe independent of a glucose sink? Like, is there some benefit to walking around with a large amount of muscle, whereas in another category, people might say, oh, that's going to have a deleterious effect because you're carrying extra weight?
This is a really interesting thing that you see in the literature right now, and even some studies that I've done have found some of this, which is when you look at these large population data sets in particular. So there's NHANES over here in the US, there's UK Biobank in the UK, and there have been studies published out of both where they have DEXA or some kind of assessment of different compartments of tissue, so fat mass, lean mass, bone mass, all those kinds of things. And there's one study that I'm thinking of recently that came out of the UK Biobank, so it's nearly 500,000 people. And in men in particular, they found that large amounts of muscle mass was associated with higher risk of cardiovascular death. But at the same time, higher grip strength was associated with less cardiovascular death. So you have this dissociation between muscle mass and muscle strength, which, for people who exercise, generally they're very well correlated, right? The bigger you are, the stronger you are on average.
Unless you got show muscles.
Yeah, unless you got show muscles like us. Real athletes in general, their strength is proportional to their muscle mass. So what you're seeing in these data sets is muscle mass that's not been accrued through exercise. It's muscle mass that's been accrued just by being in a caloric surplus. And that muscle mass is not having the same effect in terms of health benefits.
So Cartman in the beefcake episode.
Yeah, exactly. So if you gain total mass, right, some proportion of that is going to be increased lean mass. So you have more muscle technically, but I think how you accrue that mass becomes really critical. So
that's a good point.
When you look at those in those same data sets, as long as your muscle, and we did this in a study in NHANES, and we were looking at cognitive function in older adults, but we saw something similar, which is that higher lean mass on DEXA was actually associated initially with worse cognitive function, and like that, I was like, this doesn't make any sense. Like, why doesn't this fit my worldview, which is that the bigger biceps make you smarter? Like, what's wrong with the data? And I think it's exactly that reason. So once you look at strength relative to muscle mass, so we created like this relative strength metric because we also had some strength data. It was isokinetic leg extension strength. Then what you see is that as long as your muscles are strong relative to their size, it doesn't matter how big they are, if they are proportionally strong because you've accrued them through physical activity, then there's benefit to it. So I think when we talk about lean mass or muscle mass, the most critical thing is how that has been gained. and then how you use it, which then confers benefits. Just having more muscle mass because you have more total mass isn't enough for you to see benefit. And you're probably then going to see the net detrimental effect of the other tissue types that you've accrued at the same time, which is generally going to be increasing visceral fat, especially in the male population. And then that has a negative effect on cardiovascular disease health and cognitive health and all those other things.
Yeah, that was what I was going to say is like, so when you're looking at the NHANES data and you're looking at someone that is has a high amount of muscle mass, was that also looking at their total fat percentage as well? I mean, so because if you think about, okay, the guy that's 300 pounds and has been 300 pounds for 30 some odd years, he's probably got some pretty developed legs.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. There's like massive quads under there. Yeah.
Yeah. And there's probably some big calves. And so you look at the legs on some of these overweight people and obese people, and you're like, all right, yeah, you got some serious mass in there just for carrying that weight. Even then, I guess you could say that that's a functional muscle because it is doing a lot of work, but it's coming along with something that is probably canceling out the benefit of having the muscle in the first place. Do you see anything, and I don't even know if this exists, that finds sort of a sweet spot in terms of body fat percentage along with the muscle, right? If someone's carrying, let's just say, a decent, moderately large amount of muscle, someone that's maybe not a bodybuilder, but someone that's got a decent amount of muscle, are you seeing anything that shows, okay, maybe 10% body fat's ideal, 15% body fat's ideal, or where does it start to, in effect, cancel out the benefits of having the muscle from what you've seen?
Again, I've done some of these analyses and primarily using NHANES data and looking at, say, overall mortality risk. And it's tricky to answer this question. And the reason is that there just aren't that many people in these large population data sets who might fit what you're saying. Maybe somebody who has a fat-free mass index, which if people aren't familiar with it, is essentially a BMI after you've taken away fat mass. So whatever your weight is, you take away your body fat weight, and then you calculate a BMI in the same way. And so say they have a fat-free mass index of like 22 or 23, which is pretty good. And body fat percentage 10, 12%, which again is pretty good. Those people don't exist in these data sets because they're just actually quite rare. They're common in the world that you and I exist in, but they don't end up in these data sets because they're meant to represent the average
because
population.
Because they never die.
So it's funny because I might think that my body composition is pretty good. It feels pretty healthy. It aligns with some healthy blood tests. Like for me, I think I'm probably in pretty good shape, and that's gonna help keep me alive longer. But I can't say that statistically because there's nobody like me from a body composition standpoint in the NHANES data I've looked at. My age and all those other things. So I'm having to kind of guess. But if we zoom out a little bit and then say for the average population, the best overall longevity seems to be in individuals. So in men, it's a fat-free mass index of around sort of 19, 20. And again, you can that's easy to calculate. And a body fat percentage somewhere between 15 and 20%. And then for females, it's more like an FFMI around 17 to 19, and then more like 20, 25 to 30% body fat. But this is using average population data. So some people might be listening to that and be like, that sounds crazy. I'm telling people that they should be 20% body fat. But that's just what the average population data show. And unfortunately, that's the best that we can do right now because there just aren't large populations of really lean, jacked people that we followed for long periods of time. Hopefully that will change.
And I'm sure, and so it's really only, we've got NHANES and the UK Biobank, and is there anything else that really, nothing that really has like this large data sets? Because you look at, obviously there's other countries that have much leaner people than the United States that probably have better longevity, and in theory there'd probably be better data from those people, but there's probably just, that data just doesn't exist because there's not these large banks.
Yeah, Korea has an NHANES equivalent, the Korean NHANES, which is also used for a lot of this similar kind of research. But again, there just aren't those kinds of, there aren't people like you in that data. Like if I plotted, say, fat-free mass index against body fat on a scatter plot, and I put you on there, you'd be like way outside of what we see in those data sets. So we kind of end up just having to extrapolate because we honestly don't really know. We have to rely on other things then on blood biomarkers, and whether we look at CT scans or something if we're worried about heart disease risk, all these other things. So we have other tools, but just looking at body composition, we can maybe answer questions about the general population, but we can't necessarily answer questions about more athletic populations, other than, there's some nice data from, say, professional athletes and Olympians. We know they live longer, despite, maybe in some of the power sports, they've, maybe they've taken performance enhancing drugs or some other things. They still seem to live longer, except for if they do fight sports. So obviously getting punched in the head for a living is not very good for your longevity. But other than that, athletes in general do tend to live longer than the general population, but really digging down into their body composition and how that affects it is just very difficult to do.
Even seemingly in spite of steroids too, which is kind of interesting. Do you see what Meadow Henselman's
post? I just saw that.
That was kind of interesting. I usually don't get sucked into little short 3-minute videos, but I was like, that was actually a very interesting one. It was kind of, a little bit, it seemed correlative, like it was kind of drawing some inference for sure, but it was kind of interesting. It was just like, okay, because you can't guarantee that those people, basically, just so there's context so people know what we're talking about. There was basically suggesting that people that did steroids in the 1970s, when it was very prevalent and much more, I don't know if it's more prevalent than it is today, but it wasn't really outlawed yet. So a lot of people were doing it. It was assumed that pretty much everyone that was in competitive weightlifting or bodybuilding was just doing it. And then you look at them and their longevity and life expectancy was actually more than the average person. So basically the effects of their exercise, the effects were outweighing the potential risks of the steroids, which I think is a hard claim to make, and it's dangerous to really make that claim. And he handled it well, but it's kind of interesting. It's like, okay, at some point, you have to look at apples to apples and look at athletes to athletes, and that's really, really difficult to do when there's just not enough data.
I was going to say, I think some of that it is confounded by what's happening in the general population at the same time. So especially if you're thinking of parts of Eastern Europe, former Soviet Republic, what's the health of the general population? How are they smoking? What's their nutrition like? Whereas the athletes are really, really revered at that time, and they probably got the best of everything, including the steroids. But there are probably lots of other health-related factors that the athletes got that the general population didn't. So I think there were a lot of confounders there as well.
Probably higher quality steroids too. Let's be real. Whatever's out there right now that most of the broccoli head 19-year-olds are doing are probably not the same.
Yeah.
But all that aside, I want to circle back to insulin for a second, because I think this is a really important one. And I think we're getting to a point now where most people that have a decent head on their shoulders, even people that are content consumers or rampant content consumers, even people out of the low carb space, I think they know that insulin's not bad, right? But there's still some people out there that like to demonize it. And I want to come back and talk, just generally speaking, what would your overview of insulin and its effect on longevity be? Like, what if you had to kind of 500-foot aerial view? It's so easy to say, okay, insulin's pro-growth is bad. All right, how would you, if someone said that to you, someone said, okay, hey, well, insulin is pro-growth, so, growth is bad, mTOR is bad. How can insulin be good for longevity? What would your response be?
So there are two parts to that. One is that, and this is something else that I think that people are appreciating more, which is that there are several tissues, primarily muscle tissue, which are essentially, muscle tissue is the organ of longevity in many ways. And you need some insulin signaling in order to both grow and maintain muscle tissue, right? So if you want to, and then other tissues as well, like bone being really critical, and insulin signaling and metabolic health plays a role there as well. And particularly as you get older, sarcopenia and osteopenia and the risk of falls and fractures. Like those are the things that start to kill you once you get into your 80s and above. So you absolutely need to maintain the function and strength of those tissues, and insulin and proper insulin signaling are absolutely going to play a role there, just as part of mTOR and these other pro-growth pathways. The shorter term important aspect of insulin is thinking about what insulin actually does. And the primary role of insulin is to make sure that you have adequate circulating energy at all times for all tissues. So it's essentially an energy partitioning hormone. And that's going to be determined by physical activity and diet and these other things. But in the normal postprandial state, or the sort of like day-to-day in and around meals and in fasting, what insulin is mainly doing is regulating glucose control by the liver and maintaining the status of peripheral tissues such that they can provide substrate for gluconeogenesis in the liver if necessary. So when everybody says that you eat carbohydrates and insulin goes up, and what it's doing is it's shuttling glucose into cells, that's actually is wrong. That's not what insulin is doing normally. It's what the insulin does do that in type 1 diabetics, which is how we discovered the function of insulin, because some small amount of basal insulin signaling is required for insulin mediated glucose uptake, say into muscle tissue or other tissues. But what insulin is primarily doing is it's an anti-catabolic hormone, as I call it. I don't know if I coined that, but I like to think that I coined it. It's an anti-catabolic hormone. It's actually not anabolic, it's anti-catabolic. So what it does is it stops you breaking down fat tissue and breaking down muscle tissue. So it's stopping lipolysis, it's stopping proteolysis. And then it's also shutting down gluconeogenesis in the liver. So when insulin is low, what you're doing is you're breaking down muscle tissue and you're breaking down fat tissue. The amino acids and the glycerol from those processes are going to the liver. They're being turned into glucose so that you can have glucose. So when you eat something and insulin goes up a little bit, at much lower doses, much lower circulating concentrations of insulin than you need to increase glucose uptake into cells, you're shutting down proteolysis, shutting down lipolysis, and shutting down gluconeogenesis. So most of what insulin's doing is it's anticipating energy requirements and then making sure you don't have too much energy circulating at any given time. When you're in a state of energy surplus, and long term that can lead to energy toxicity, which is essentially more circulating energy than you can handle, and then that's a combination of usually glucose and free fatty acids. Then insulin is, you start to become insulin resistant, and insulin is elevated during that period, and it looks like, because it's part of this whole system, it looks like insulin is the bad guy. But what it's really telling you is that at that point you're energy toxic. So I think we have to dissociate this kind of marker of insulin resistance and energy toxicity from the actual functions of insulin. And yes, having normal, good insulin function is critical, and that doesn't happen when we are energy toxic and we've started to accumulate body fat beyond what some people call the personal fat threshold, which is a nice kind of idea to better understand the point at which we become energy toxic and then start to accumulate ectopic fat, visceral fat, which we know has a number of detrimental effects, including having this very high turnover of fatty acids, so which increases circulating fatty acids all the time, as well as negatively affecting the function of tissues. So I think it really comes down to a slight misunderstanding of what insulin does. And when insulin is high and you're measuring high insulin, what that's really telling you about the health of the individual. And we can't just focus on insulin because it's essentially, at this point, it's just something we're able to measure. And it's a marker of this dysregulated metabolic state rather than necessarily just being the bad guy in its own right, if that makes sense.
No, it makes a ton of sense. So from an anti-catabolic standpoint, if you look at it from, I don't know if you saw that recent paper. I just did a video on it, but it's not huge data, but as investigating whether glucose or like having carbohydrates surrounding a workout is actually going to contribute to ribosomal biogenesis and rRNA. And it was basically like ultimately no, like there wasn't like this additional muscle building effect. And I know this is a little bit off topic from the world of longevity, but since we're talking about this, I'm curious about it because it's like you can almost divide sort of the muscle building effects of insulin into almost kind of like 3 potential categories, like, right? Like you've got like the anti-catabolic nature of it. You've got the fact that glucose is supposed to fuel, high intensity activity. So that would make sense that it could help that in that case. And then of course you've got like the RNA and the rRNA kind of side of it, whereas like the ribosomal biogenesis and actually like having the sort of allowing for that rate limiting step to occur to build muscle. And the study demonstrated that it didn't really have any effect on ribosomal biogenesis. But I still can't help but think that from an anti-catabolic standpoint, it could aid in muscle hypertrophy. And I'm curious your take on that.
I think probably the most important thing is adequate calories and adequate protein. There are studies that show that increasing insulin on its own doesn't increase muscle protein synthesis.
Yes.
And really it's substrate driven. You have to have adequate circulating amino acids for that to happen. So the main function is you need just enough insulin to stop the breakdown of muscle tissue, and then the anabolic side of muscle building is substrate driven. Just like, and the fat tissue is essentially the same. So you need a small amount of insulin to stop lipolysis, but actually the fat tissue is continuously taking up circulating fatty acids. So if you think, one way to think about it is actually both in the muscle tissue and in the fat tissue is that the tap is always, so imagine you have a bathtub, the tap is always running, right? There's always fatty acids going into the adipose tissue. Insulin is the plug. So when you have enough insulin, in order to start the signaling process, the plug goes in and then the bath level starts to rise. But insulin doesn't turn the tap on and it doesn't make the tap run faster. So in adipose in particular, where they've really looked at this, there's always going to be fatty acid uptake into the adipose tissue. And then insulin is just the plug or not, whether the plug is in or not. And the muscle seems to be the same. So you need enough insulin to stop proteolysis, and then the muscle building is substrate driven. It's possible that at supraphysiological doses, if you were, say, a bodybuilder and you're taking exogenous insulin with obviously enough carbohydrate that you need so that you don't become hypoglycemic, you may then get an additional increase in muscle protein synthesis and muscle building, but it's slightly hypothetical, and certainly within like normal physiological insulin levels related to diet, insulin doesn't seem to be driving that process.
And I mean, in theory, you're spiking insulin when you consume the protein anyway.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's a little bit of a moot point. It's not like you're cranking it up to 11 and it's going to make it so that you're building more muscle.
Well, it is common to use in some bodybuilding circles. It is common to use insulin, but they're using very high doses, and whether it's actually benefiting muscle growth is a little bit hypothetical.
Well, especially when they're probably getting the kind, what is it, Humulin versus Humalog, right? Like where you're getting like a long-acting. I don't even know if long-acting insulin would have any benefit there. It seems as though that's such a long effect. Like you're not getting that acute effect that you're really looking for in a bodybuilding sense. So I think unless Humulin's the fast-acting one, right?
I can't remember.
I think Humulin's the fast-acting. Yeah, it's just like, I think that's in the bodybuilding circles, Humulin is what is commonly used, and that's really hard for most people to get, right? So it's, and independent of that, I think, I'm seeing less and less people, when Dr. Mike Israetel was here, he was saying, okay, well, post-exercise, having carbohydrates can certainly bring cortisol levels down, which may have a potential effect on recovery. But this same study, I can't remember where it was published, but it was pretty new. Have you seen that, our RNA study I was talking about?
I saw that you posted about it, but I hadn't seen the actual study.
And it's basically, I mean, it found that carbohydrates peri-workout really didn't improve volume, didn't really improve. It didn't improve anything throughout the course of a 12-day span in this case. The one thing they did see is that the one thing that mattered is as long as glycogen stores were relatively elevated, not even full. That was the only determining factor. So it was like when you had the carbohydrates didn't matter.
Yeah.
But do you think that having carbohydrates post-workout and reducing cortisol slightly as a result of bringing insulin levels up and having some carbohydrates would have any performance or recovery effect, or is that a stretch? And I'm not trying to put Israel on the spot. That's not.
To be honest, I trust his opinion in this arena, in the muscle building arena, over mine. So
come on, he's tiny.
To be honest, I don't know, because I would say that the one thing that we've really, as a field, come to appreciate more over the last sort of 10 or 20 years is that relatively, the relative changes in hormones in and around workouts don't really seem to make any difference in long-term muscle growth. In maybe somebody who's training at very high volumes, and that's coming with a significant stress, and maybe then the glucose does bring down cortisol. It's possible, but is that effect based on cortisol, or just the additional total calories that are coming in to help recover from exercise? I'm not sure.
That's where I always got a little confused on it. It was like, is this more calorie driven than anything else? It's just it's easy to ingest liquid carbohydrates and get liquid calories, right?
Yeah.
So it's like you're not seeing people drinking olive oil after their workouts typically and getting fat calories.
Unless you're Brian Johnson.
Does he drink olive oil?
Oh yeah, he makes up 60% of his calories, doesn't he? I thought I saw.
I knew he had olive oil. I didn't know he drank it. But yeah, because as far as carbs are an easy way to eat more for sure.
Yeah.
At least especially in a liquid form. So that was exactly where my head was at. Was this just a driver to be able to eat more and potentially kind of stimulate recovery there? Now, when we come back to the longevity piece, because I know we went off on a muscle building tangent, but there is some, I don't know, it parallels in a way. Again, I'm not trying to, I don't want to talk smack on Paul Sell. That's not where I'm going with this. But, he's implied some things about insulin being essentially kind of pro-longevity, right? So in a way, he's like, I want to consume more carbs. He's like, Thomas, you got to go for 400 now. I'm like, no, I'm not going to go for 400. I'm happy with my 100. But can you see any benefit to kind of what he's talking about there? He thinks, okay, if I push these carbohydrates high, then it's more recovery, it's more pro-growth, it's more, insulin good. He's and who knows the direction he's going with that. Is it to try to just be very polarizing from how he was before and just, talk about it and get eyeballs? I don't know. But either way, is there any validity to what he's talking about there?
There are certainly populations, and some of the longest lived populations in the world, I think, do have relatively high carbohydrate intakes. Certainly, I'm not a massive fan of the idea of the blue zones, because I'm not really sure how well what's been sold as what they eat actually maps onto what they really do eat. But there are certainly populations where they live a long time and they're relatively healthy, and a large proportion of their calories come from carbohydrates. So I don't think that we could say that they're going to tell you that more higher carbohydrates are pro longevity, because I don't really think there's any evidence for that. There are certainly lots of very long-lived populations that eat a relatively small amount of their calories from carbohydrate, and it's determined largely by the latitude at which they live, because that then determines the availability of carbohydrates from the food across the seasons. So Iceland being one, they have some of the longest lived population in the world. I say that as half Icelandic. There is not a starchy carbohydrate to be found anywhere in the wilderness of Iceland. You might get some berries in the summer, like these teeny tiny, pretty sour berries, right? Nobody's there eating pasta and potatoes, or at least not historically. So I think if we're going to look at populations around the world and how they eat, I think we can say that certainly carbohydrates alone are not important, critical determinants of longevity. Like, they're not required. But equally, they're not demonizable, because you have some people who are eating larger proportions of their calories from carbohydrate, and we're talking like whole food carbohydrates. Say the Okinawan potatoes or whatever, and all the Kitavans also ate a large amount of sweet potatoes and had good health for long periods of time. But I don't think that we can say that that's going to be this like critical driving factor. And it's probably got a lot to do with, I think ancestry starts to play a role. Like, what did your most recent ancestors eat over the last few hundred years? I think we're certainly going to be adapted to those kinds of foods. But when you have individuals who experience issues with one extreme or another, and I remember, so Paul is a good friend of mine. He used to live in Seattle, and when he was doing strict low carb carnivore, I know he had a bunch of issues that resolved then once he added carbohydrates back. So I think we have to appreciate that, to be honest, like the exact distribution of our macronutrients probably matters a lot less than we want it to. Yeah. And you should eat whatever supports what you want to do and makes you feel good. And for different people, that can be vastly different. And that's probably the adaptability of human metabolism and how different it is from person to person is one of the things that I've increasingly come to appreciate, because I remember 10 years ago, I thought low carb and keto was the thing. And then you see that just really doesn't work for some people. And you go in the other direction and you see that like some people really thriving on a very low fat diet and others who really can't do that. So I do think that, adequate protein is important. Enough insulin signaling is important. I don't think that insulin is pro longevity necessarily, except for the fact that you need some, and it's probably going to be more related to being able to support the physical activity you do. So like Paul surfs for several hours a day, right? And then I think getting in additional carbohydrates could certainly support his athletic pursuits. And that's really what it's going to come down. It's going to come down to what's supporting your physical activity, what's supporting your muscle mass, what's supporting these other aspects of health, rather than saying like insulin itself, I want more of it because it's pro longevity. I certainly haven't seen any like strong evidence of that across, the body of literature that we have.
Mayonnaise and Vienna sausage it is for me. Anyway, Tommy, where can everyone find you, man?
I am on Instagram primarily at Dr. Tommy Wood. I also have a podcast with my good friend and collaborator, Dr. Josh Turk, who's a neurologist. It's the Better Brain Fitness Podcast. And we have a Substack for those who are particularly interested in the brain. It's betterbrain.fitness. And then anytime we release articles or podcasts or whatever, that gets released there. The Substack's free.
Right on. Well, thanks, my man.
Thank you. Thanks.